All right, so Adrian, the first thing I want to say is that I don't want to be speaking for all journalists, that's for sure. What I can speak to are some of the things that I have noticed over the years and some of my observations about being a professional journalist during my career. The first thing I would say is that I don't like the word or the phrase fake news, and that is because I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's exact. I think there are basically three types of reporting. Good reporting, which is vetted and fact-checked. I think there's sloppy journalism in which maybe facts aren't checked and some things turn out later to be untrue. And I think the third type is spin. So those are the things that I think you really want to watch out for. The phrase fake news, I think, is being thrown about by people who don't like the fact that they're being criticized or examined by a free press.
How to recognize a fake news?
The first thing that I would suggest is if you're watching an interview and they're talking to a so-called expert, make sure that that person actually is an expert in that field and doesn't have a big axe to grind. So, for example, if you're watching a story about the gas and oil industry wanting to drill on public lands, and all you're hearing from are people who are former oil execs, you should be a little skeptical of what the conclusions might be. What you want to see is somebody who is an independent expert, meaning not on the payroll of big gas or oil. That's an example.
What makes a fake news sound true?
Well, what makes a fake news story sound true may be that the reporter has included sound bites or quotes from somebody who is supposed to be looking like an expert, but in fact is not. So if you have somebody who is, say, from the Petroleum Institute, that might sound like, well, oh, that person probably is very familiar with petroleum, and therefore they're going to be expert in giving you all kinds of information about petroleum. But you've got to be careful because that person may also be on the payroll of petroleum and therefore not be willing to share a lot of the information that may be not terribly flattering to the oil and gas industry.
What to do when watching news?
What I always recommend when you're watching news is that you triangulate. In other words, check to see if other legitimate reporting agencies are reporting the same information. If you're only getting a story from one particular news source and everybody else is covering something else, that should raise a flag for you. It should make you suspicious. Even legitimate organizations that have not confirmed a story themselves frequently will report it, but what they'll say is, we have not independently confirmed this information, but X news agency is reporting this. And usually if they're doing that, it's because they believe the veracity of the reporting from that other agency. So for example, if NPR is quoting a story that has appeared in the New York Times, NPR will say, we've not independently confirmed this story, but the New York Times is reporting such and such. Now they wouldn't do that if they didn't think that the New York Times reporters were good, qualified, and putting together a well-resourced and vetted story.
Why do people create fake news?
In my experience, journalists don't come out of journalism school wanting to create fake news. In fact, it's almost a religious calling. You don't make much money in it in most markets. Certainly newspaper people are not making a lot of money these days. You go into journalism because you care. And you usually care about getting the story right. So when somebody is throwing around the term fake news, it's usually a smear because they don't like the information that's coming out in the news. So when somebody says, oh, that's fake news, it's time to put your waders on and start looking around in the murky depths because there's usually something that they're trying to hide.
What you do when you come across a fake news?
Okay, now again, I would submit that a fake news story, if you've identified a fake news story, it's because you have detected some degree of spin or perhaps a source in the story who was not reliable or not expert in the field or in some other way seemed slanted. No news source is perfect, no reporter is perfect. But if you're coming across a story that you have identified as seeming to be fake news, dig in a little bit. Maybe there is something there. Maybe what they are saying will tell you a whole lot about the people behind that reporter. In other words, if you've detected what you think is a fake news story, it's likely that that's being pushed for a reason because they're deliberately trying to influence you. When you have identified that, now it's time to think about who else is interested in trying to get me to believe this. Is there money involved? Follow the money was one of the big phrases in the whole Watergate investigation. Follow the money. If there are big moneyed interests that stand to gain from a particular type of structure of a story, you want to dig in.
How are you affected by the concept of fake news?
We have a tradition of a free press in this country because the founding fathers recognized that a free press was crucial to holding government officials and large, powerful entities and people to account. I've got a couple of quotes. This is a quote that apparently was attributed to Thomas Jefferson, and scholars have raised some question about whether in fact he actually said it. But I still think that the quote is a valuable thing to keep in mind. This quote says, "When the speech condemns a free press, you're hearing the words of a tyrant. When the speech condemns a free press, you're hearing the words of a tyrant." Historically, there are a lot of examples of that. And one of the first things that tyrants typically do is they try to get a hold of the free press, discredit it, talk about how it shouldn't be believed, and then they try to take it over. And Vladimir Putin is a good example of that. There's another quote from John McCain here. And pardon me, but I'm going to read this again. As John McCain said, "If you want to preserve democracy as we know it, you have to have a free and many times adversarial press. And without it, I'm afraid that we would lose so much of our individual liberties over time. That's how dictators get started." It doesn't mean that the news is all going to come to you cleanly, purely, absolutely, honestly, and factually correct. In fact, it's just the opposite. Part of our job as citizens in this country is to do the work, sort through the information, vet it, check to see whether people who are being held up as experts in fact are experts. And again, triangulate. That's what I always recommend. Check the story. Make sure that other reputable news organizations are telling you the same thing, because they'll all be scrambling to verify the information. Believe me, they're in competition with each other, and nobody likes to be scooped. Thanks, Adrian.